you very much, Mr. Commissioner.
I spoke at the outset about 3 royal commissions that I counted that were focused on species indigenous to the country, and I spoke in particular of the 2 that were fish related, Pierce and the senator back east with the cod fishery, Senator Kirby. I should just inform you the 3rd royal commission that I determined related to species was the Royal Commission on Seals and the sealing industry in Canada. It's interesting, all 3 royal commissions focused on species that are of economic significance to the nation, and as I say, 1,600 species that could be focused on where there are issues of extinction, but clearly the government puts priority on these particular species for obvious reasons. I have 35 minutes left. Graciously, Mr. Leadham has provided me with 10 minutes that he didn't use during his submission, and I believe with Ms. Baker's approval, we might require those 10 minutes. I'm at page 21 of my submission relating to habitat management, enforcement, enhancement, and restoration. I have covered, as you see from my table of contents, areas where I suggest there is a litany of non-performance by DFO, and I attribute most of that non-performance to financial incapacity. When it comes to habitat management, enforcement, enhancement, and restoration, I suggest that the record is sad in its performance to date by DFO, and my learned friend Mr. Leadham did a very persuasive job in speaking to this issue, and I don't want to spend a lot of additional time other than to make mention of the following. At page 21, I speak of Mr. Duncan's testimony. Mr. Duncan, you'll recall, was a First Nation witness, and he spoke about how the single most devastating impact on sockeye salmon was, from his perspective, habitat related. And I think that a lot of other people would probably would agree with the testimony he gave at this inquiry. Action step 5.3 of the WSP states in part, habitat program work will shift from being largely reactive to being planned and strategically directed in order to protect habitat and to implement management measures that meet the long-term objectives specified in Strategic Plan Strategy 4. Nice words. I certainly didn't see any initiative leading in that direction. The Fisheries Act, sections 35 and 36, impose upon DFO statutory responsibility. And yet, the evidence before this tribunal is that DFO has failed miserably in discharging those statutory responsibilities. We have Mr. Sprout at page 22, who was an apologist for DFO in so many facets of their work. And yet he said at page 22 of my submission that DFO is, quote, still struggling in the habitat area. Those were his words. We have Mr. Sprout conceding that their capacity with habitat initiatives, quote, has been very curtailed, unquote. None of this is very comforting. These are individuals, in the case of Mr. Sprout, who was an RDG, if my memory's right, and who has just retired from the department, but spoke in defense of the department in so many areas. And yet this was his assessment of their discharge, of DFO discharging their responsibilities in habitat. The PPR that was before you, paragraph 8 of the PPR, spoke in part with the following statement: loss of fish habitat has been identified as a leading factor in the decline of Canada's fisheries resources, and salmon in particular. Mr. Wang, who was a witness before this commission, who was an area manager in the ecosystem management branch in the Interior, said habitat is changing for the negative. These are quotes. They're all documented and footnoted in my submission. This failure to meet the most minimal standard of acceptability should be of great concern to the Commission and in turn to the federal government and the Canadian public. Now, the evidence highlighted some of the more glaring examples of DFO's abdication of this responsibility. Mr. Morley testified how critical habitat is as a significant component of the WSP, and he also spoke about how Frizzy does not apply habitat issues in their assessment, leading to management decisions. I come at the top of page 24 to habitat management. There is evidence before you that certainly up to the closure of evidence, as I understood it, there was not one habitat status report that had been completed. Now, I am mindful of the fact that the Government of Canada has filed a reply that says now there are 6 completed, and I have not understood how they come about that assessment of 6, but let's assume that it is correct. Of the 6, from my knowledge of geography of British Columbia, only one of those 6 areas, as stated in their reply, is within the Fraser River watershed. And that one is the Harrison area. Well, it's somewhat ironical that indeed, if the department has completed the habitat status report work in respect to Harrison, it's the one area where we appear to have a healthy, vibrant stock with increased productivity of that stock year in and year out of recent times. What I don't understand, Mr. Commissioner, and I have questioned so many witnesses at this inquiry who presumably could bring information to this inquiry, is why has Cultus Lake been ignored by DFO in respect to the habitat status reports? You'll recall the evidence given by those in authority who were responsible for that initiative of carrying out habitat status reports. And you'll recall that the evidence was it has not been done, and my learned friend Mr. Taylor's reply confirms it hasn't been done. Well, I don't get it. I don't get it when we have been informed from day one, if there's any watershed that has spoken about it, focused upon by this inquiry day in and day out, it was Cultus Lake for obvious reasons. It is a weak stock, and it is a stock that is driving DFO in its management decisions to curtail the harvest of my clients. And yet, how do my clients look at this in seeing that the Cultus Lake situation is so unimportant to DFO that they would not prioritize a habitat status report for that particular lake? Then the question is, well, why did that happen? And the answer really lies, again, back to the financial situation. Ms. Reed, in her testimony, Rebecca Reed, said that the financial situation was the cause of her problems in discharging these responsibilities. And she said that in previous years, the spending was over $300,000 a year in her department, but now it's only $50,000 a year. Herein lies the defense of DFO to their failure to do what seems somewhat intuitive to any of us who have been following or tracking the concerns of weak stock in the Fraser watershed. Now, Mr. Sprout, and I'm at page 25 of my submission, raised another troubling layer to this whole issue of habitat, and that is that there has been a loss, from his perspective, a loss of provincial capacity. And we have learned about the interjurisdictional responsibilities when it comes to habitat, and he and others, I believe, spoke to the provincial incapacity, or more to the point, a provincial loss of capacity as opposed to the past when it came to attempting to ensure habitat protection. We have Mr. Niletz, Mark Niletz, who testified that it was difficult to implement strategies 2 and 3 where there was a weakness with the habitat database, as he put it. So it undermined so much of the WSP implementation process. We have David Carter at page 26 saying there was no reason to be optimistic into the future. This exchange took place, I believe it was my cross-examination quote, and you also heard testimony yesterday, and sure, you were well aware of this, but there's no reason to be optimistic, certainly for this present fiscal year, correct? Answer, yes. That can't comfort the public, of the Canadian public, when we're facing down further budgetary reduction in DFO's budget for the West Coast, and this is the state of affairs at this moment in time. We then have concern about DFO's failure to really discharge any semblance of responsible surveillance and enforcement of habitat. My learned friend Mr. Leadham did such a good job in that respect and spoke this morning about small projects going completely under the radar. Well, as I heard it, the evidence was if you, as a proponent, filed a referral, you got some attention from DFO because they would look at your program, your project, and would give some advice. But the evidence is clear from the witnesses that if you chose as a proponent to go under the radar and not file a referral, you would not be pursued by DFO for any form of surveillance whatsoever. Well, the people that are bona fide, that are concerned about our environment, that are concerned about our habitat, would of course go to DFO to have their plans reviewed because they would be concerned about causing detrimental effect to the environment. It's those that are not bona fide, that do not hold those values, will obviously not file referral and in turn get away with significant, what can be significant violations of the Act, and indeed, in turn, it leading to serious environmental damage. Mr. Carter, at page 27, spoke about how he couldn't sleep at night because of the situation. Mr. Huang, at the top of page 28, testified that DFO has seen a trend towards non-compliance, given the lack of follow-up on applications of referral or where parties don't even submit a referral. Mr. Nelson, who I thought was one of the most forthright witnesses to come before you from DFO, interestingly enough, he's about to retire. He testified also sleepless nights, saying, frankly, he didn't know how things were going to unfold. He was obviously frustrated with the budgetary situation and with what appeared to be future budgetary restraint. Habitat restoration, my next topic. I saw no sign whatsoever, I saw no evidence brought before this inquiry that DFO was doing any significant habitat restoration work anywhere within the watershed that is the focus of this inquiry. When it comes to enforcement, we had evidence that, quite frankly, the DFO C&P officials who are bestowed with the responsibility of enforcement simply could not do the job. We had the unbelievable evidence of Mr. Nelson that to prosecute parties under Section 3536 or to ticket them really was futile because they did not have the means to enforce those violations and to collect those fines. He told us there's over $1 million in fines for the Pacific region that remain unpaid. Well, when word gets out that DFO does not have the capacity to even enforce and collect on fines imposed, we're in a pretty sad state of affairs, if I may put it that way to you, Mr. Commissioner. Now, I then deal briefly at page 35 with, page 30 of my submission with no net loss. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Again, an admirable policy, one that one would have thought would be embraced in a comprehensive way by DFO, and we learned that, quite frankly, it is nothing more than worth no more than what the paper it's written on, that in fact we have not been really enforcing the no net loss situation, and we had evidence that indeed we are losing that battle and that we are the sum total of it is that we are in a negative situation on no net loss, not a positive as was meant to be. I come at page 31, and I put all this in the context of Ms. Dansereau saying everything is fine, we've got proper funding, and there's nothing to be concerned about. I go on with my checklist. Nursery Lake assessment. We learn, and I'm at page 31, that under the former Pacific Salmon Fisheries Commission, there was an extensive program. Now there are only 3 lakes under this program, a Nursery Lake assessment, and all 3 lakes are large lakes. Mr. Commissioner, the whole foundation of the WSP is looking at weak stocks, and some of these weak stocks are in small lakes. One would have thought, be intuitive to expect, that DFO would be putting some money into Nursery Lake assessment of those lakes that are home to some of these weak stocks, but that is not what is happening. Mr. Whitehouse did indeed speak to the fact that obviously one should have expected some focus on small lakes. In questioning, he said, first my question to him, and you appreciate, sir, under the direction that the WSP takes us, that the health of stock in some of the small CUs can be critical to the harvest rate of my clients out in the marine environment, obviously. And his answer was absolutely. And yet it's not being done. I come to the next item on my checklist of non-performance, page 32, selective fishing. There you heard that the program, its funding ran out in 2002 and has not been further pursued. And yet Mr. Hargreaves in his testimony spoke about the importance of programs to develop new means of fishing in a mixed fishery in a more selective way. I don't want to spend time on this, but my clients testified at this proceeding of their commitment, of the commercial fishing industry's commitment to selective fishing, to cooperating with the DFO in trying to develop new techniques in a mixed fishery. I mean, it's obvious that it's in my client's interest that they support this process. My learned friend for the First Nation Coalition speaks about one little incident back in 2004 where there was some testimony given by my client, Mr. Chris Ashton. It is totally explained in my reply to this commission of what is raised by the First Nation Coalition. It is one isolated incident where the Sainer Association that I represent said that there had been 5 years of testing of this particular mechanism and that it should be taken to scientific review because that was the agreement made from the beginning, and it never was. Then, in any event, the government went ahead with the program that year, and to this day, there has never been scientific review. I say that the evidence is conclusive that my clients are supportive of selective fishing. Why would they not be? For obvious reasons. I come to Habitat Stewardship Program, another in my checklist here. Again, effectively abandoned by the government. We heard evidence about it. I have reference to it. The next item, the Salmon Enhancement Program, reduced as of the mid-1990s, no longer really viable. The Lake Enrichment Program, the program's now defunct, but for one Vancouver Island lake. The test fishery area, if there's anything that I think everybody agreed to in this commission, it's that the test fishery is critical for proper management of the resource. And yet we had Ms. Dansereau in her more latter appearance before this commission unwilling to make a commitment that even the test fishery would be a program continued when funding ran out next year, I believe at the end of this fiscal year, March 31st of 2012. Even that is on the block and could be chopped to pieces. When it comes to research, again, a total lack of commitment by DFO to do any form of adequate funding. I break that down, research, into 3 areas: projects abandoned, projects that are currently underway that have an uncertain future, and thirdly, research that's being recommended. Let me deal with each of them very briefly. On projects abandoned, I give as an example my written submission, the radio telemetry work. We've heard over and over again of the importance of telemetry work in trying to figure out some of this complicated science of what's really going on with the fish and why they might be making an early entry into the river and early migration and things of that sort. Well, the program was abandoned. It was spoken to by a number of scientists, and frankly, there was some evidence of how disappointed those scientists were that that program has been abandoned. Why has it been abandoned? Presumably, again, financial. I come to the second area under research, current research with an uncertain future. Well, if there was one witness who was more anticipated for this inquiry than any other, it was Dr. Christina Miller. And she came forward with some important findings of her research that everybody hung on every word of her testimony. Yet even she testifies at this inquiry that as for her project, it was currently, I quote her words, insecure. She described her current situation as troubling and stressful. And Mr. Commissioner, if even she is stressed with a lack of funding for a project that appeared so important, so critical to DFO, so help me for all the other research that is currently underway with uncertain futures. Lastly, research being recommended. You have heard from so many scientists of research that they feel is necessary. Most recently with Dr. Laura Richards speaking of research in the field of a relationship between salmon farm disease and the transmittal of the wild stock. Again, are we going to see any of that work done? It all depends on the financial situation of the department into the future. Now, I say that unless DFO's budget is increased, the recommendations that this commission makes in terms of future research is quite frankly totally for naught, and our time's been wasted. I come now to the next topic at page 37, the inequitable consequences of only partially implementing the WSP and underfunding DFO. I say it's been a piecemeal implementation of WSP. I've made the point already to you that stakeholders bought in on the assumption that there'd be a fulsome implementation with all components being recognized by DFO as being important to the sustainability of the stock, and that all those programs would be properly funded and the programs would be implemented. Gardner Pinfold speaks to that, and I say no more in that regard. I say that what has happened here is that when some of these witnesses, Farlinger and Dansereau and so on, spoke about the spirit of the WSP being implemented, what they were talking about was the closure of harvest rights, the closure or limiting of harvest in return for greater escapement. That, I suggest, is all that they could really speak to as being what has been implemented to date in terms of affecting the public interest. And Mr. Morley spoke to this at page 38 of his submission. I have a quote that basically, if I can paraphrase what he said so well, it is that DFO has taken the route of least resistance and of least cost to them by simply closing the gates on harvest without paying the slightest attention to all the other responsibilities that come with the so-called protection of weak stock. Dr. Riddell spoke about transferring the cost to other people. At page 40 of my submission, Dr. Riddell said in part that whether it's the commercial fisheries outside that have been substantially curtailed, other people are bearing some very substantial costs by us not doing sufficient monitoring and science. And he was speaking of my clients and the First Nation community when he said that. He went on and said at the top of page 41 of my submission, so it's a tough environment. I think we are passing costs on to other people if we're not going to do the fundamental work to really examine things like Carl's now finding evidence out for delayed density dependence. Clearly, I submit to you, Mr. Commissioner, that the commercial fishery has taken the brunt of loss as a result of DFO's limited approach to WSP implementation and harvest management strategies in general. I come now to part 3 of my submission, the non-fiscal issues in DFO's mismanagement. The revisiting, and I subtitle this, the revisiting of biodiversity debate, overescapement, and WSP. Now, down at the bottom of page 41, I said I wouldn't read much of my submission. I do want to read a mid-paragraph at the bottom. I say, however, the question must be asked to what extent the WSP effectively responds to the biodiversity concerns and at what cost. The underlying problem arises when escapement figures are dictated by a few small, weak stocks, which leads to the result that exploitation rate for abundant stocks in a mixed stock fishery is curtailed to meet weak stock spawning needs. That in turn leads to overescapement of strong stocks, the consequences of which are described further in my submission. I take the position that the WSP is a failed experiment with an aftermath of significant problems. Dr. Woody appeared before this commission, and I don't want to overstate this, Mr. Commissioner, but I think you heard from people that they approached him as if he walked on water. He is an extremely respected scientist in Canada in the field of fish ecology, and his record speaks for itself. And he said, and I have a number of quotes here, and I invite the Commission in its own time to review exactly what Dr. Woody said. At page 42, he said, in part about overescapement, that the overescapement problem, quote, was not an insignificant issue from the standpoint of future returns and harvest. This is not a quote of nobody. This is a quote of Dr. Woody. Then further on, he described in the context of this issue of overescapement at line 17, in a quote, we're conducting a big experiment by seeing these large escapements. And as we are seeing these large escapements fail to produce, we're learning more as to what the optimal escapements are. But at the same time, we're seeing these failures starting to show up because it's been only in the last 8 or 10 years that we're experiencing these very large escapements. And he goes on and quotes that are before you at page 43, a quote from Mr. Lapointe. Now, Mr. Lapointe also is someone of great respect. He appears to have the confidence of this country in being appointed the head of the Pacific Salmon Commission. And he is a scientist. And he said at page 43 of my submission, and to think that there is no risk, no consequence to the ecosystem of a very large escapement, I think is not consistent with all of our training. That's pretty sobering from a man with that experience. And then we come to Dr. Walters. Well, some of my learned friends would like to just dismiss Dr. Walters as if he didn't ever come before this commission and he didn't testify. But they're flying in the face of a scientist with an incredible reputation, not just nationally, but internationally. Even Dr. Riddell, who I think this commission relied on to a certain extent, he was certainly a frequent witness here. He refers to Dr. Walters as probably one of the world leaders. He further referred to him as a world-renowned leader in fish population dynamics. You know, my learned friend representing the First Nation Coalition, in her reply, and I think this deserves just a second of time. At page 26 of her reply, she says in paragraph 80, by his own admission, Dr. Walters' concerns regarding over-escapement arise not from the point of view of the biology or ecology of the Fraser River salmon, but from the point of view of commercial access to available harvests, unquote. She then has footnote 82. Well, I have read footnote 82 from the transcript. I've had others read footnote 82. It isn't even a quote of Dr. Walters, for the most part. A portion of it is, and it has absolutely nothing to do with a statement that suggests, if I'm interpreting this correctly, it is implying that Dr. Walters is in the pocket of the commercial industry and has come before you and is only focused on the issue of commercial viability of the fishing industry. He is a scientist who has dedicated his life to the marine ecology. He is published and is world respected. I heard no evidence that he has ever done any work for the commercial industry. There was never any suggestion in cross-examination that he somehow or other carried a bias. And yet my learned friend implies from that paragraph, as I read it, that he's not really concerned about the ecology. He's concerned about whether fishers are making an adequate income. I don't want to be the one to tell Dr. Walters that was said about him at this inquiry. I want to carry on with the whole issue at page 44 of overescapement and the concomitant consequences. I say there are three consequences to the overescapement issue. First, that there's been no appreciable improvement with the status of the weak stocks. Two, that the harvest management decisions of overescaping strong stocks has led to serious detrimental effects. And three, the losses of commercial harvests have been devastating to the industry. I say that if my learned friends want to take this issue on and take the position that there is no case to be met that overescapement is causing an effect on the productivity of major salmon stock within British Columbia, they have to answer the evidence of these three scientists, Walters, Woody, and Lapointe. I've said at line 41, taken together with the Gilhousen reconstruction, I think we have to now admit substantially higher risk of severe stock declines and severe cyclic population behaviors under reduced harvest rates. He went on at page 46 at the top. He said, well, I'd say in the Quesnel case, a drop from in the millions down to the 100,000s is pretty catastrophic. Yes. So here we have Dr. Walters, and I'm going to suggest to you nobody really challenged him in his testimony, speaking of the situation being catastrophic. We have Mr. Lapointe at page 46, midway down. He said, I've known Carl since 1982. He's brilliant. He's usually right. Sadly, DFO appears to blindly pursue the strategy of overescapement at the expense of serious losses to healthy stocks that make up the majority of the Fraser sockeye run. Mr. Nilletz acknowledged that overescapement was not factored into the WSP benchmarks. Dr. Woody at page 47 said in part, line 6, the experiment has shown that the overescapement that I term overescapement as has resulted in disastrous results for the Quesnel sockeye run. It's very difficult, Mr. Commissioner, to understand how DFO can continue to ignore with respect, my learned friend says I'm without time. I had 35 minutes even without getting 10 minutes from Mr. Leadham. I had 25 minutes from 5 after 12 to 12:30. That was 25 minutes. I came back from lunch. I have in total an hour, and I can have 5 of my learned friends. I was given 10 minutes by Mr. Leadham, so I don't follow my learned friend.
Well, on my calculation, it included Mr. Leadham's time, but if you could wrap up quickly.
Well, I can wrap up quickly. Mr. Commissioner, with respect, if indeed I have been given 15 extra minutes, I still have Ms. Pacey to do her section, which will take approximately 8 minutes. I would like to complete this. I have taken up 30 5 minutes right now, but I'm given an extra 15. And we are above, I understand that our schedule is well within means right now.
Why don't you proceed for another 10 minutes, Mr. Rosenblum, please?
Thank you. Page 47, Dr. Woody goes on to speak of the experiment of overescapement as being a disaster. At the bottom of page 47, I then say it is very difficult to understand how DFO can continue to ignore the strongly held opinions of these respected scientists. I come to Canada acknowledging that there is a risk about overescapement. In Canada's reply at page 5, Canada says this at paragraph 16, while Canada acknowledges that there may be risks associated with overescapement, it is clear that these risks must be balanced with the negative consequences of underescapement, that is, not achieving escapement targets. But even Canada acknowledges these dangers. Now, my learned friends, and I don't have time to deal with this obviously, Mr. Dixon speaks about how there was no evidence of any diminished return or any decline in stock because of overescapement. I say it totally flies in the face of all the evidence that I've been speaking about. Even the quote that both he relies on and Ms. Gardner rely on from Dr. Peterman and Dorner, even that quote speaks to a recognition by those two scientists that Quesnel could well be affected by the overescapement issue. And I leave the paragraphs that my learned friends cite for the Commission's review, but even that evidence acknowledges a overescapement problem within the watershed of Quesnel. You know, Mr. Commissioner, this is very much like the canary in a cage. In the old days in mines in Britain, miners would go down and would bring with them a canary in a cage, and if that canary died after their arrival, they knew they had a gas problem and they quickly retreated from the mine site. This is the same situation. This is a canary in a cage where the canary has died. It happens to have died at Quesnel. But who's to say that if it's happening at Quesnel, it's not going to happen in other locations, in other watersheds? And in fact, Dr. Walters is of the opinion that it already is happening, and so does Dr. Woody believe it's happening in other watersheds. This is a serious issue, and it's an issue where the precautionary approach should be applied. And my learned friend, Mr. McDade, dealt with precautionary approach yesterday in a totally different context. I say that DFO has failed to recognize the precautionary approach or apply a precautionary approach when it comes to the whole business of overescapement. I think it's an important thing. There is an exhibit before this tribunal, which is Exhibit 1851, and I've asked Mr. Lunn to have it available. It is a very significant exhibit, and it will be before you on the screen in just a moment, because it shows a reduction in productivity of the Fraser sockeye starting around 1989, 1990, and it happens to coincide with a decision by DFO to apply a reduced harvest as a management decision, and in return to increase escapement. And that correlation between what was decided upon by government back around 1989, 1990, and the productivity decline of the stock during that time, I suggest is somewhat sobering and should be considered by DFO in future management. I now hand matters over to my colleague, Ms. Paisley.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Katrina Paisley for Area B and D. I'm fortunate that many of the points I was going to make have been made by the Conservation Coalition and the Aquaculture Coalition, so I will be able to move through my submissions fairly quickly. The first point that I wish to make, and one recommendation that we urge upon yourself, Mr. Commissioner, is that the Commission make a recommendation with regards to DFO's conflicting mandates as they relate to aquaculture. And in this respect, I do adopt the submissions of the Conservation Coalition of Mr. Leadham this morning. And just to add, just to make the point clearly, the department has an overarching responsibility to make decisions in the interest of the conservation and protection of fish. And yet, as you will see in my submissions at page 58, DFO has assumed an active role in the business development and promotion of the aquaculture industry. It is our submission that this conflicting mandate will continue to impede DFO's ability to meet its mandate to protect wild salmon from the impacts of aquaculture, and that the department must really be in a position to focus its fiscal resources and policy decisions regarding aquaculture on its conservation priorities, and should be really insulated from the business interests of the aquaculture industry. The second area by which we make recommendations are with respect to research. And I'll move through these very quickly because the first point is simply to follow upon Mr. Rosenblum's submissions that it's very important that the department allocate fiscal resources appropriately towards its research activities, and that more broadly, DFO is funded properly to carry out its mandate. In addition, we urge DFO, we urge the Commission to consider making a recommendation regarding the direction and area in which DFO does conduct this research, and that it really prioritize research activities that look into its conservation mandate and conservation questions, and be in a position to have effective and evidence-based or be able to engage in effective and evidence-based decision-making regarding fishery management and conservation. In our written submissions regarding increasing transparency and cooperation within the aquaculture industry, the first point is with respect to fish health data. It is our submission that this data should be readily available to the public, and that the fish health data should be available both at the farm and fish level. To respond to some points raised by the province, we say that their justification for wishing to hold this information as somewhat private is unjustified. To say that the public, because they may not have the scientific background to be able to understand that data, should not be privy to it, we think is not an appropriate justification to hold that information privately. And to say that public disclosure would limit the industry's willingness to make that report to the province, or in this case the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, is simply unacceptable. So we ask the Commission for a recommendation that detailed fish health data be made publicly available in a timely manner. Very briefly, with respect to siting of fish farms, at page 63 of our submission. And with respect, we disagree with submissions of my learned friend, Mr. Blair, for the BC Salmon Farmers Association. And unfortunately, I don't have time to get into the great debate between Drs. Dill and Noakes. But what I do say in our written submissions is that Dr. Noakes makes a series of overbroad and overgeneralized statements that are not founded in the data that he was working with. And this critique is echoed by many peer reviewers whose comments are found at Appendix 4 to his report. And in my reading, he does not address those critiques appropriately and continues to make overstatements such as salmon farms pose no significant threat to Fraser River sockeye salmon, and that salmon farming has not contributed to the recent decline in Fraser River sockeye salmon productivity. And we say that the conclusions of Drs. Dill, relying on the work of Dr. Connors, which in their report says, quote, the relationship between farm production and Fraser sockeye survival in long-term data sets suggests that the farms are having some sort of negative impact on wild salmon productivity, most likely in concert with other factors in the marine environment. And we say that in light of the fact that there are gaps in the research and that there's a general consensus that more data is needed to really understand the impact of aquaculture, we suggest that Dr. Noakes is not in a position to say that he has disproven that aquaculture is having a harmful effect. And that in fact, looking at the long-term data series that Drs. Dill and Connors rely on is sufficient for this Commission to apply the precautionary approach, say that in this context, the risk posed by aquaculture meets the threshold of the precautionary principle, and that as a result, that this Commission should urge government to take immediate steps to move open net fish farms off of migratory pathways. And finally, with respect to the fish farm audit question, I'll simply say that we adopt the submissions of the Aquaculture Coalition and the Conservation Coalition in this regard. Thank you.
Indicate to you, Mr. Commissioner, there are areas of the submission that obviously I didn't get to, in particular allocation, terminal fisheries, which is a big issue to my clients, both spoken about in the final submission and in the reply. And obviously we ask the Commission to give consideration to those submissions of the topics that obviously we have not had time to cover today. We set out a set of recommendations. They speak for themselves. They are obviously consistent with the position you've heard in our submission today. Thank you very much for the courtesies that you have afforded to us and to all counsel throughout these proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenblum and Ms. Pacey.
Good afternoon, Mr. Commissioner. Philip Eidsvik for the Dairy Gillnetters Association and the BC Fisheries Survival Coalition. I have an hour and hopefully won't use it because I can see Ms. Baker back there looking for more time, and I hope to be able to give her some at the end. I'm not going to go through our submissions in detail. I will refer to a bunch of number of exhibits and highlight some of the areas that I think are important. And I think you probably read better than I can speak, so I don't think there's any need for me to read our submissions into the record. On the first, if I could bring up Exhibit 1947, and I need to deal with a little bit of a difficult issue at first and then move on. And this is the BC sockeye salmon population declines, probable causes, and recommended response strategies. And I bring it up because the question of terminal fisheries is a very big issue before this commission. And I bring it up because the report was prepared by the commission scientist, Chief Commission Scientist, Mr. David Levy. And in the report at page 26, he talks about the need to restructure the BC commercial fishery. And he talks about the effect of mixed stock fisheries. And at page 26, the second paragraph, he says the best opportunity for restructuring the fishery lies in the development of terminal fisheries to protect sockeye biodiversity, reduction of fish on weak stocks. This will require the development of commercial inland fisheries. There will be a reduction in the value of the fishery due to reduced fish quality. Nevertheless, a cannery-grade product can usually be obtained. And if we go to back to page 21, he speaks specifically about the high exploitation rate leading to the Cultus sockeye crash. And we agree that Cultus sockeye was overfished, though it might have been a different story if we had looked after the habitat, as many of the previous submissions today have been said. Nevertheless, we have a concern with Mr. Levy continuing on inside the Commission, advising the Commission on whether terminal fisheries are a good thing or a bad thing. We fear that no matter what we say in the Commission, he will have the last word compared to ours. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, but I do note on Early Stewart at page 14, he talks about the impact of the Early Stewart fishery, and I've heard earlier today about the wild salmon policies needed to protect Early Stewart sockeye. But as Mr. Rosenberger from DFO testified, the public coastal commercial fishery hasn't fished Fraser sockeye only twice in the last 20 years. Just a fishery and a stock that the public coastal commercial fishery generally does not fish. And that's at page 9 of our final submission, and the quote from Mr. Rosenberger's in footnote number 9. So I'm going to make an unusual recommendation and suggest, Mr. Commissioner, that Mr. Levy be removed from further participation in the Commission at this point. And that's the difficult issue I didn't want to deal with, but I know when I go back down the dock, if I didn't say something, I might be hung by the yardarm. So as the only fisherman in here, and non-counsel, I had to get that on the record. That said, I'd like to thank the Commissioner. I know you sat through 125 days of hearings, and for your patience with the only non-lawyer in here. And I say this now because I always run out of time at the end, and I wanted to express our thanks for the administrative staff at the Commission as well, and Natasha Tam and Sarah Panchuk and Natasha Dukas and Leo Pera and Len Giles and Karen Hefferland, who's tried to transcribe me as I talk too fast, and the web designers and maintainers who did such a wonderful job and made the handling of the vast amount of documents and exhibits here much easier with their quick posting, the easy-to-use website. I've been involved in some litigation, but never this volume of documents, and never have had the pleasure and joy of working with such an efficient way to handle documents. So thank you for that. And I want to move on to our submissions now. And the first issue I want to deal with is water temperature and climate change, because we get talked about that a lot. And if I could have Exhibit 74 up, Mr. Lund. It's the 2005 report of the Fraser River panel. And if we can go to page 24 when we get there, it's the issue of water temperature. And we recognize that warm water in the Fraser River contributes to mortality. There's no denying that. But it's not the sole equation. And we can see here at the top graph, we're seeing actually passage in fairly reasonable water temperatures in 2005. And of course 2005 is important because that was the progeny year of 2009. So the water conditions weren't bad. And if we go to page 37, Mr. Lund, at the bottom paragraph, my hesitation here, Mr. Commissioner, is to make sure that we don't just throw up our hands and say, well, it's water temperature and everything flows from that and the story's over. At the last paragraph, and I'll just read the bottom part of it, page 37, river conditions that relate to migration success were in ranges generally considered benign, particularly for summer run fish. Thus, at elevated mortality levels, they may not have occurred. They may not have been due to the same processes observed in years when high discharge or temperatures led to high en route mortality. A radio tagging program confirmed the levels of en route loss, but information was insufficient to determine causal mechanisms. So here we have a case where a large number of fish went missing in the Fraser River. The temperatures weren't bad, and so we had radio tagging that said, yes, fish were lost, fish disappeared, but of course radio tagging only tells you that they disappeared. It doesn't tell you why they disappeared. And here's an example where you just can't point and say water temperature is the whole answer. There's other factors as well, and I'll try to get to some of them in my submission. And it's one of the problems that we have in science, and I'm sorry, Mr. Lund, to jump around, at page 33 of my submission right now, of our final submission. And it was a conclusion by, in the cumulative impacts paper by the commission. And the theory was it's climate change, it's warm water, and if we look at these various other fisheries around the coast, the same thing happened to them that happened to Fraser sockeye. We saw a decline in productivity. One of those areas was page 33, Mr. Lund.
He's in the wrong submission.
I'm in the first submission, sorry, not the reply. And so we went and looked at Barkley Sound, and of course in Barkley Sound we had a very large incidence during the time the productivity dropped with the mackerel attack, where we had mackerel eating salmon smolts. And I asked Mr. Memoric in cross-examination if he was familiar with that, and he wasn't, but of course Regional Director Sue Farlinger was aware of it. And it's one of the problems with being overly reliant, sitting in an office somewhere looking at computer models without knowing what's going on in the field. And this is just not an unusual circumstance. It happens time and again. And sorry, Mr. Lund, I'm jumping around. I'm going to Exhibit 1424. And this is relates to the Okanagan, and I'm at page 9 of it, to the Okanagan Lake sockeye run. And of course, if we're going to look at Barkley Sound or Skeena, the other areas that Mr. Memoric relied upon, we should look at all of them. And this is an interesting one because the entry to Okanagan Lake, of course, is through the Columbia River system. And we look at the graph, we can see very high levels of fish in 2008, 2009, and 2010. Yet Okanagan sockeye pass dams. They have a very long migration route. They're further south than the Fraser River sockeye run. So again, you just can't point to warm water and say everything's warm water. It's all climate change. Here we have a run that's in a more difficult area to rebuild than Fraser sockeye. And yet 2009, 08, and 10, 3 years of study by this commission, all show pretty good abundance levels. So I'm cautious not to, I'm suggesting that the commission not read warm water, climate change in isolation to other factors. And if we go to the cover page of this, I think it's helpful as well on the terminal fishery issue, Mr. Lund. I point to this picture and I bring it up, the color picture on the front. These are fish that are caught in the terminal fishery in the Okanagan Lake. You can see the poor quality of them. The yellowish is actually an off color. They're turning black. It's certainly not a silver bright sockeye salmon caught in the lower Fraser and the same fishery in Johnson Straits, or even better in the troll fishery on the outside. This is not a product that we built our world markets on. And I'll move on from that. And one of the helpful exhibits that I've noticed throughout this process has been Exhibit 75 by John Roos, Restoring Fraser River Sockeye. And if we can pull that up, and I'm going to go quickly to it. And I want to go quickly to page 144, Mr. Lunn, in the last paragraph. And while you're bringing it up, this is about predicting Fraser River pink salmon, but it's useful because the Commission initially had a really difficult time predicting the abundance of pink salmon. And they, in this section here from page 142 to 144, they went through a variety of processes. One of the ones they looked at was changing salinity in the entrance to the Fraser River. If you had a high flow, you'd have reduced salinity. If you had low flow, you'd have increased salinity. But what's interesting to me is in the very last paragraph of this page, the Commission's statement, in predicting Fraser pink salmon returns, the Commission learned there was not yet just one reliable method to use for consistently forecasting. It appeared for a number of years the salinity survival relationship held considerable promise, but how long it will be useful for predictions, only time will determine. And this is one of the constants in the management of Fraser River sockeye and Fraser pinks. It's change. There is a little bit of climate change. There's salinity changes. There's flow changes. There's predator changes. The complaints of the current managers that they're bewildered by complexities and uncertainties is simply not a reasonable excuse for the decline of the stock or the decline of the fishery. There's always uncertainties and declines. What's changed is DFO's ability to deal with it. And I'd like to pull up one more exhibit, if I could, Mr. Lunn, Exhibit 608. And this is the 1961 report of the International Pacific Salmon Fisheries Commission. And it was the PDF page, page 6 of 45, Mr. Lunn.
I've got a file error on that.
Okay, well,
Exhibits. I'll do my best to bring it up.
just to save going to it, I have it up on my computer and I'll read the passage that I was after. And 1961 is an interesting year because a large amount of decent escapement in the previous 4 years previous, good fry, good smoke production.
Which page are
I'm on page 4 on your PDF. I'm on page 4 or 6 of 45. Sorry, 6 of 45. And at the top of the page, and so the IPFC back in 1961 was confronted with exactly the same problem this commission was confronted with in 2009. Enough fish got on the spawning grounds 4 years earlier. Sufficient numbers of fish made it out of the river, but we should have had a big return. And in 1961, the fish didn't come back. And they sum it up in the second paragraph there, that the anomalies in the runs of Fraser River sockeye pink salmon, apparently related to unusual fluctuations in the marine environment, have occurred with alarming frequency during the past 10 years. These anomalies were discussed in the 1959 annual report and have been individually referenced for several years. While similar anomalies occurred prior to 1950, it appears they occurred with far less frequency, though the data for prior years is meager and confused by other factors such as the Hell's Gate obstruction. So here we are, now that's 1961. We're hearing the same kind of claims about disaster, crisis, we don't know what happened. And 1961, the commission kind of summed it up in about 2 paragraphs. Something went on in the marine environment after the fry got down to the mouth of the river. And again, it's just getting to the point that there's fishery management involves managing change, and responding to change. If I could go to our reply submission, Mr. Lund, please, at page 24. Yeah, sorry. I should have had them better labeled. This is a graph of gross escapement data that we took from the commission PPR that was produced. That was quite useful. And the blue bars represent the number of fish that passed through all public commercial fisheries in the coast and got as far as Mission. And we've heard a number of people point fingers at mixed stock fishery and the troubles with the public coastal commercial fishery, how rapacious they are. And here beginning, if we look at the 2008 cycle year, which is the proper way to look at this is by cycle, we see a low of 1964. And you can see in every single year since 1964, a long time before the first Greenpeace, a long time before the Suzuki Foundation or any conservation coalition, commercial fishermen were with the IPFC were rebuilding the Fraser River sockeye run. And if we look at the 2009 cycle, again the same issue. If we could flick to the next page, Mr. Lund. This is the 2010 cycle. Again, pretty steady rebuilding with the exception of 1994. And I go into that in my submission. And again, the 2011 cycle, a little bit more difficult, but a trend still going steadily upwards. So way back for 40 years before this commission came, the commercial fishery was doing its job, getting enough fish to Mission to not only sustain the run, but to greatly enhance it. And if we look at the chart on the side, for example, if we look at the 2010 cycle, in 1946 the gross escapement was 2.9 million. In 2002 it was 12 million. You think that was too high, but you can see even in 1986 it was 5 million, 1990 6.6 million. So what you have is a conservationist approach to fishery management that was lock, stock, and barrel integral to the management of the fishery going way back to the 1960s. So what this means is a couple of things. One, the problem of the decline or any decline in the Fraser River sockeye fishery is not an issue that happened in the public commercial fishing fleet. They did their job, put the fish to Mission. So you can't solve the decline of the Fraser River sockeye, for example, by putting share-based management systems in the public commercial fishing fleet, because that's not where the problem is, and these graphs are solid evidence of that. Selective fishing in the coastal commercial fishing fleet won't solve the problem of Fraser River sockeye, because as the graph shows, every single year, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 in 40 years, the run got bigger. Reallocation to upriver commercial fisheries won't solve the problem, because the problem's not in the public coastal commercial fishing fleet. This graph is definitive of that point. Now, Mr. LaPointe testified that past Mission, upriver from Mission, where the public commercial fishing fleet has been prohibited from fishing for more than 100 years, 15 million fish have gone missing since 1992. We don't have answers to that yet. But the public commercial fishing fleet stops fishing at Mission. Anything that happens upriver from Mission is not the responsibility of the public fleet. In a recommendation on this, I thought it would be useful if the Commission could complete the end of the run size and escapement data to produce similar graphs by run timing groups, so we could find out, what was the escapement on the early Stewart. And there has been in the PPR, there's gross escapement and net escapement, but it would also be useful to have produced graphs of harvest by user group, because the first step in determining has there been overfishing is determining, well, if there was overfishing or was there not? And if there was overfishing, who overfished? And as I've said, the early Stewart is one of the problem groups, but the public commercial fleet doesn't fish early Stewart sockeye. Now, getting back to the missing fish between Mission and the spawning grounds, I'd like to go to Exhibit 604, Mr. Lund, please. I'm in Exhibit 604, Mr. Lund. And this is the 2001 report of the Fraser Parliamentary Standing Committee on Fisheries. And I'm going to page 17, where it describes page 17 of it. And it describes the 2000, this report was a lot of investigation into of course, the 2001 Fraser River salmon fishery. And in there, the table at the bottom, Mr. Lund compares the 2001 salmon fishery with the 1987 salmon fishery. And this is useful because the run size is a little bigger in 1987, but not a heck of a lot bigger. And so we had 1,200 seine boat days. That's a seine boat that is fishing on the coast unlawfully, how many days of fishing they had. So if the fleet was 100 boats, they had 12 days of fishing. So they had 1,200 days in 1987, 40 in 2001, 10,000 gill net days in 1987, 0 in 2001, and a public commercial harvest on a run of 7.7 at 3.2 million, and in 2001, about 250,000 sockeye harvested. Substantial growth, though, in the Aboriginal fishery. So the 2001 fishery, that was the beginning of the 2005 fishery, led into the 2009 fishery, which is the original subject of this commission. So the evidence is public commercial fleet didn't fish in 2001, they didn't fish in 2005. So when you're looking for problems for 2009, we have to look elsewhere. And if we go to page 10 in that, it's also useful, Mr. Lund. Because this table 1 shows the huge reduction that's already been made in the public commercial fishing fleet. From an original 536 seine licenses, we're down to 271. From 2,200 gill netters, we're down to 1,000 or 1,100. Troll is down from 1,300 to 529. So massive decrease in the size of the public commercial fishing fleet since 1996. And of course, the seine is 2 areas, so that fleet is split between the north and the south. The gill net is 3 areas, and the troll is 3 areas. So huge reduction in public commercial effort on the Fraser River sockeye run. So my request on the recommendations for this section is simply that the Commission complete a PPR, updating the tables of net escapement by area and by stream. And you'll see in the Restoring Fraser River Sockeye publication, if the tables that ended in 1985 at pages 382 to 397 were continued into 2011, it would be very useful. And then, of course, the harvest by country and user group. Now, I'm going to a quick comment that's an issue that's come up again and again, is how to settle disputes in the commercial, Aboriginal, and recreational fisheries. And we often get told in the context of Aboriginal issues, the issue is negotiate rather than litigate. As the evidence showed, pilot sails were put in on the Fraser River in 1992. So that was a negotiated settlement. We're going to open a commercial fishery. All the fish will be counted. But of course, one of the participants was the Stolo. The Stolo litigated the Vanderpeek case into the BC Court of Appeal in 1993, appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, and a ruling was issued by the SCC in 1996, and just a myriad of cases since then, a number of which I've cited in our submissions. So the principle of negotiate versus litigate is only effective if there's a cessation of litigation. Clearly, a number of groups continue to litigate and negotiate. To me, it's one or the other. And what we're seeing is all the major and important issues about Aboriginal claims and rights are going to be litigated by one Aboriginal group or another. Field fishing rights, commercial fishing rights, title, it's all going to be litigated. It's just a matter of who. So the negotiate versus litigate is, to me, a false paradigm or untrue, inaccurate analysis of the issue. I want to talk about enforcement for a minute. 2011, the transcript, Mr. Lund, and page 27, line 43.
Just a moment. September.
September 27th.
Thank you. And page.
Page 27, line 43. And this is Mr. Bevins speaking on behalf of the federal government. Of course, he's a senior Ottawa official and assistant deputy minister, I believe. And there's been complaints by enforcement officers about the lack of support at senior levels inside the department for the enforcement function. Our organization thinks enforcement is DFO's #1 priority, takes precedence over everything else. We can have all the wonderful policies we want, wild salmon policies, meetings and discussions, and we can decide to protect Thompson River coho, But if we don't have the enforcement resources in the Fraser River to enforce the closure, then all those wonderful meetings and policy statements are for naught. And Mr. Bevan, at that line, I'm at line 43, and he's referring to Mr. Nelsons, who is a highly respected enforcement supervisor. And Mr. Bevan is just being a bit critical because he's saying you want to do the same things in the old ways. And then if I jump down to page 53, and we're talking at this sequence about being able to distinguish between a food fish and a legally caught commercial fish. And Mr. Bevan at line 26, he responds to the question, and he says, well, actually what we're doing now is separating FSC from the commercial fisheries. Economic opportunities is in order to make that a much clearer separation so we can have more capacity to ensure the FSC is used for its intended purpose. So in evidence, I entered exhibits 1948, 49, and 1950. And they're a series of license opening times. We don't have to go there, Mr. Lund. And what we did, we looked at one page, and so we went from August 10th to the August 31st in those 3 stacks of licenses. And between August 10th and August 31st, there was only 4 days of no fishing in the lower Fraser River by Aboriginal interests. That doesn't include the commercial fishing for my fishermen, my fellow fishermen, the public commercial fishery. Almost every day on the Fraser River, there was some type of fishing activity. And even if separation would work, clearly there is no separation. And Ms. Farlinger spoke to that, and I'll just give you the reference. On September 27th, page 35, line 26, she recognized that there's simply not enough days in the week to separate all the groups because we have so many fisheries going on the Fraser River right now. And this is a marked contrast to the traditional fishery pre-1992, where there was usually 1 day of commercial fishing and 1 or 2 days of Aboriginal food fishing. So there was 3, sometimes 4 clear days on the Fraser River where fish could get, once they got past Mission, they were safe. There was a sanctuary above Mission where they could pass through uninterrupted, unmolested on the way to the spawning grounds at least 3 or 4 days a week. We've lost that. And so we come to the recommendations part on enforcement, and Mr. Lunn, if I could go to Exhibit 77, and this is the Fraser River 1994 report. Enforcement issues and enforcement problems are not new to anybody who's been around the Fraser River for the last 20 years. Peter Pierce complained about it in 1992. If we could go to page 60, please, Mr. Lunn. John Fraser, his report complained about it in 1994. Williams complained about it in 2004. Parliamentary Standing Committee repeatedly. So at the last paragraph of this is John Fraser's recommendation, the very bottom. And I'm going to jump to the second sentence, and he's referring to the enforcement budget. The first step in the process must be a proper assessment of what is required, at a minimum to ensure adequate enforcement. That cannot be achieved in the context of a budget exercise. Once the essential elements of an effective enforcement system have been specified, then and only then can the authorities look to see if available funding is sufficient. If at that time it is perceived that the existing budget cannot support adequate enforcement capacity, DFO should be prepared to reallocate priorities within the department. Now, I can't think of much stronger language for a commission or investigation body to use. The message is clearly, DFO, your first priority is enforcement. You will determine an enforcement budget, what you need to properly enforce the fishery, and then you'll go ask for the money. And if the money's not enough, then the department should reallocate within the department. But as we've seen from testimony by persons like Mr. Bevan, enforcement's simply not a priority. So we're seeing high levels of poaching, illegal sales. We see 97% of the Aboriginal food fish being sold illegally. We see habitat not being dealt with and not properly enforced, as Mr. Leedham and Mr. Rosenblum did a fine job on that. So the Fraser, my point is that the John Fraser, the Peter Pierce, the Williams recommendations are pretty well useless. Mr. Commissioner, you can urge that they have an effective enforcement scheme or a strong enforcement scheme. It's pretty well useless, because strong enforcement or effective enforcement will be looked at completely differently by the deputy minister sitting behind the desk in Ottawa versus the fishery officer stuck on the river at midnight on Saturday night. And he's out there with not enough staff. Maybe in some years they didn't even gas for their boats. So our recommendation is that you need to give something that's measurable, that the standing committee can assess at the end of the year, that the public can assess at the end of the year. And we're saying that the measurable factor is in BC you need 250 fishery officers. We have about 150 right now. The evidence is they cost about $60,000 a year. This is only $15 million in the context of a $150 million budget. And they need a certain amount of funding for O&M, which I don't have the evidence before us to deal with that. But if you say 250 fishery officers, the standing committee can, every year they can say, well, how many fishery officers do you have? What's their budget? But if you simply recommend that they have strong enforcement or good enforcement, all that does is start a debate about what is or what is not strong enforcement. And we urge that a separate line item in the budget be dedicated solely to C&P, and that the regional C&P heads report to an assistant deputy minister of C&P in Ottawa, not through the regional directors here. Tendency is money comes out here, supposedly included for the C&P budget, and it often gets distracted into other projects. And I see it's 1:15. Mr. Commissioner, perhaps a good time.
Yes, thank you very much.
The hearing will recess for 15 minutes.